Good evening, everyone. I'm Karen MacNeil, author of the Wine Bible and editor of the digital newsletter Wine Speed. And this is a live virtual tasting on world-class Viognier, and especially the fabulous Viogniers made by superstar winemaker Louisa Rose at Yalumba Winery in Australia. Yalumba is actually Australia's oldest family-owned winery. So thank you for being here. If this is the first time you're joining us, we're so happy to have you. And if you've joined us before for Taste with Karen Live, we're glad you're back. This is going to be really a very fascinating tasting and talk because, number one, the wines of Yalumba are really so renowned. Yalumba, again, is in South Australia. Two, because Louisa Rose is a Viognier specialist. And three, because I think Viognier is not really an easy grape to work with. There's not very much of it in the entire world. But as you and I are about to find out, it is so delicious and so compelling, and we're going to find out why. Before I properly introduce Louisa, I just want to put up that map one more time, because I think it's always helpful to see in your mind where we're talking about. So let me just bring this map up here for a second. You'll see there that South Australia is right in the center lower quadrant, I guess. Quadrant means four, but the center lower part of the continent of Australia. And you see that Yalumba is actually right in the Barossa and Eden Valleys, vineyards in both of those places. South Australia is where many of the greatest wines on the Australian continent are from. Okay, so Louisa Rose, welcome. We're so glad to have you.
I've been looking forward to this, Karen. Thank you for having me.
Terrific. So Louisa, I want to start by talking about you for a minute. You've worked for the Hill-Smith family who own Yalumba. You've worked for them for nearly 30 years and 13 of them, I think, as chief winemaker. You've won what appears to be every major award given in Australia. And importantly, you are a director of the Australian Wine Research Institute. And for those of us who are watching who may not know about the AWRI, this is one of the most prestigious research institutes on wine in the entire world. Did you always know you wanted to be a winemaker?
I think certainly since I was about 10 or 11, as I was growing up and going through our early primary school, my family started to plant a small vineyard. They bought a little bit of land just outside of the city and started to plant a vineyard. And we'd go up there on weekends and on holidays. And as I went through, high school, never had another job. I think I might have mentioned at one stage to my mother that perhaps I should, like all my girlfriends were going out and getting jobs at supermarkets or at McDonald's or something, maybe I should do that. And they said, no, if you want a job, we'll give you, another day's work on the weekend. But I loved it. And that working with nature, the seasonality of it, watching the vines, from bare dirt, getting your hands dirty, planting them, watching them grow, pruning them and training them, and then ultimately picking the grapes. But I do remember that defining sort of moment when we picked our first grapes, and we'd been picking all day, and we loaded them onto the trailer behind the pickup truck, and we drove them to the winery. And the sun was going down, and the winery was lit up sort of like a Christmas tree, as wineries always are at night. And there were people running around, and the grapes and everything was sort of happening, and you could smell the fermenting wines. And I thought, oh, this is amazing. I want to be a winemaker, without actually really knowing what that meant, but it seemed like a good idea. And my love of science, which has sort of underlies all of the winemaking, I suppose, is what sort of clinched the deal rather than spending my time just in the vineyards.
Well, one more personal question, if I may, because Australia today is really full of fantastic women winemakers and viticulturalists. I'm thinking of people like Prue Henschke or Virginia Wilcox at Voss Felix, or Vanya Cullen out at Cullen. But Yalumba is a bigger winery. And I'm wondering if it was kind of a tough road to the top.
No, it wasn't.
Great.
I think, yeah. And I really don't have any war stories to sort of, to share in that regard. I do consider myself incredibly lucky to still be working, with the same family that I started working with in 1992. I literally got a job here at Yalumba when I was still studying winemaking. I didn't really think I would ever come back to South Australia because I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Victoria. And so I thought, I should just get a job for a few months, somewhere other than where I'll spend the rest of my life. And I did, and I'm sort of still here. So, and the reason that, not only am I lucky that I, chose the right place to start with, but the wine industry in Australia particularly, and around the world, has grown and become much more global in that time. So the timing of me starting really in the Australian wine industry in the early 1990s, was the time when we were planting new regions, we were planting more vineyards, we were exploring new varieties such as Viognier, because the world was starting to go, let's try Australian wine. So we had this increasing market and with this ability to really explore, and they were really exciting, quite heady days. But getting back to your question, I think the great thing about when you're working within the wine industry is that, let's face it, we're dealing with a luxury product. We're dealing with a product that in most cases people have as part of their lives, part of their special memories, part of their experiences, maybe, part of their family meals. So, it's important not to take yourself too seriously, but to enjoy it, because, we're making a product that we want people to enjoy. And I think generally within the wine industry, we find that we're all here just to, enjoy each other's company. And we know how much we can learn from each other by working together, sharing stories. I mean, the ladies that you've mentioned, I know them all really well. And I know I could pick up the phone any day and talk to them and many other hundreds of winemakers in Australia if I had a problem or a question. So that doesn't tend to build resentment, and it certainly has broken down any barriers there might have been, allowing women to do well in the industry.
Yeah, how beautifully said. It is an extraordinarily generous business. Let's talk about Viognier for a minute, because Viognier's home, of course, is Condrieu in the northern Rhone. But in the 1970s, even in Condrieu, which admittedly is a very small place, but it nearly went extinct were it not for Georges Vernet and a few other Condrieu producers who sort of just painstakingly planted it and promoted it. It might not have been saved. Tell us about Viognier in Australia and how it came to pass that you began to work with it.
Yes, so you're right. It was almost extinct around the world. And even Condrieu in the time that we've been working with it is 10 times as big in vine, in area under vine, as it was then, even though I think the whole appellation is only about 120 hectares. So I don't think it can get any bigger now. Look, I think there was a fair bit of luck involved in it. Although we have our own nursery, our own vine nursery. We propagate new varieties. We have the ability to import and look at new varieties and clones. Now, the world is, it's like a candy shop of varieties. You can't bring in everything. But Viognier, being a Northern Rhone variety, was something that seemed to us, even though we knew nothing about it really, other than that it was a white variety from the Northern Rhone, it seemed like a variety that would make sense to grow here in the Eden Valley, because the other varieties of the Rhone, particularly the red varieties such as Shiraz, Grenache and Mourvèdre, have been growing, and some of the vines still on their own roots growing since the 1840s in the Barossa. And in the Barossa, if you don't mind, Karen, if I just do a little bit more of a geography lesson, and thank you for the map, that makes it much easier. In the Barossa, there's two regions. There's the Barossa Valley, which is a little bit lower in altitude. It tends to be a little bit richer and more fertile soils. And then we've got the Eden Valley, which are the hills to the side of the Barossa Valley, and they're higher in altitude and a little less fertile and more shallow soils. And the analogy between the Barossa Valley and the Southern Rhone and the Eden Valley and the Northern Rhone is quite sort of compelling. We know that Shiraz grows in the Barossa Valley and it makes a lovely sort of, rich wine, and then in the Eden Valley, more perfume, more more elegant. And I don't want to make it sound like they're the same as the Rhone. Of course, our terroirs are different, but there is that similarity. And so it seemed to us that maybe varieties like Viognier would do well here. So in 1980, through our nursery, we propagated up enough to plant 3 or 4 acres, and that became the first vineyard that we had. The first vineyard, the first commercial vineyard, at least in Australia. There were a few vines in one of our research stations. Luckily, that's where we managed to take the cuttings. And yeah, for us, the rest is history.
Let's talk about the classic flavors, the classic good flavors of Viognier as it presents itself, specifically there in the Eden Valley. I can tell you from my standpoint, there is some Viognier in California here as well. And I can tell you what really not good Viognier tastes like and smells like. It smells like duty-free perfume. I mean, it's like, oof, so bad. But none of your wines are that way. When you are making Viognier, what are the classic flavors that you're looking for?
Yep. So they are the stone fruit orchards. So the apricots particularly, and it's apricots is a word we use to describe Viognier, whether you see dried apricots or fresh apricots, sometimes, preserved or apricot jam. Sometimes the white flowers, orange blossoms and things like that. But I take your point that they can go a bit too far sometimes, those floral characters. And then, as they get more complex, and usually as the wines age a bit longer, you start to see flavors like ginger, like freshly grated ginger, white pepper, sometimes some star anise. They're the flavors that we tend to see here. It's interesting I've read all the books about Viognier over the years that people have written, and tasted wines from the Northern Rhone, and they often have a musk-like character to them, which I find quite appealing. We really don't see that in our wines. I find that interesting, knowing that our vine material came from there. So I think that's an expression of the terroir that we don't see that character.
Yes, and then I think texturally your wines, which we'll get to in just one second here, but texturally they're very lively too. There's a big current of freshness going through all 3 of these Viogniers.
Yes, and that's really important, because one of the characteristics of Viognier is naturally it's very low in acidity. Now, we love that about it, and we respect that about it. But if you're not careful with Viognier, it can become quite oily and sort of blobby and round, and not have that lovely sort of length. And so because Viognier doesn't have a lot of natural acidity, in fact, its acid is much similar to a red wine than a normal white wine. We also, respect the fact that Viognier skins have quite a lot of white tannins or phenolics in them. And so we don't use skin contact or ferment on the skins, but when we press the grapes, we like just that little bit of those lovely small fine phenolics to come into the juice and hence into the wine to give it that refreshing characteristic. And sometimes I talk about it being almost like a refreshing bitterness, bitterness in a good way, perhaps more like a gin and tonic bitterness or something, rather than, a red wine astringency. But that's what gives the freshness. That's what gives that vitality to these wines.
I love that idea, refreshing bitterness, a kind of, sometimes around here we talk about a noble bitterness when we mean something that really is such a positive and is acting as a counteraction to the acidity in the wine and to the fruit in the wine. Well, let's start and taste in here. We're going to start with your Y series. Let me hold up the bottle. You make more than one Viognier. We're tasting 3 today. So let's give this a try. As I said to you earlier, I have no idea how you ever managed to make this wine in the US market. Costs around $15. No idea how you could have made such a beautiful wine for that amount of money. But tell us about this wine.
Okay, so the Y series is part of a group of wines that we make called the Y series. This is the Viognier, but we have other varieties as well. And for all of these wines, They're made with no oak. So we're looking at just fruit. The fermentation in this wine is all in stainless steel. They're all made, in fact, as all of our Viognier wines are, with just the yeast that come naturally out of the vineyard. So it's all wild, what we call wild yeast fermented or non-inoculated. And the regions that it comes from are all within South Australia, but there are a few different regions. So our Eden Valley grapes go into the next two wines that we're going to talk about. This wine has grapes that come from the South Australian Riverland, which is the vineyards that grow on the banks of the Murray River. Now, the Murray River is sort of the lifeline of South Australia. If you think back to the map that Karen, that you showed earlier, I love that map because it's just around the edges of near the water is green, and then everything other than that is white, and those white areas are deserts. So this sort of lifeline of the Murray River that comes down, it's a food and wine bowl of South Australia, and just a beautiful, sunny, warm place to grow grapes. So we get a lot of the grapes from there. We get some from the Barossa Valley, so the warmer part of the Barossa, and we also get some from our vineyard at Rattenbully. Now, Rattenbully which starts with a W. It's one of those awkward words to pronounce. Is just next to Coonawarra. Now, Coonawarra is about 4 hours drive south, about 250 miles, and it's right down the bottom of South Australia, in that part of the state that you would have seen. Very influenced by the Southern Ocean, quite a maritime climate. Even though it's about 50 miles from the sea, it's only about 100 feet, 150 feet in altitude. And so the influence, of that Southern Ocean and those winds and those fogs that come off that area are quite pronounced, even that far inland. So very different regions. They blend together, I think, and layer those lovely sort of characteristics that each of those terroirs subtly have that are different. But really what we want this wine to be is a great introduction to people. So if you've never had a Viognier, have a glass of the Y Series Viognier. And when we first started making this wine in the late 1990s, we were a little bit concerned. The world didn't know Viognier. How were we going to go with a wine like this that had an awkward pronunciation, perhaps? And we found it didn't matter. People were just going, this is amazing wine. We heard anecdotally people going and saying, I want that Yalumba wine that starts with a V. My friends told me it was really delicious. And that's it. We just want people to see this wine and go, wow, it's familiar enough. It's familiar to me as a white wine, but look at all those beautiful, delicious flavors that it has.
Yeah, and I think in this wine, one of the things that I've observed sometimes is that people confuse an aromatic variety, and Viognier is one of the 4 main aromatic varieties. They confuse an aromatic aroma with a sense of sweetness. This wine is so bone dry, and the acidity is so pretty in it that it finishes with this very clean, fresh, almost mandarin orange, little snappiness. And you don't find yourself confusing it with sweetness, which I think in the Rhone, sometimes people do. There are all these flowers and in the wine, and they feel like, this is just too sweet. It's an easy confusion.
It is an easy confusion, Karen. And it comes back, I think, a little bit to that balance of what makes them refreshing. And because it doesn't have a lot of that natural acidity, it is that balance with those, those lovely sort of fine skin phenolics that give it the freshness. Because if they weren't there, so just say, for example, as a winemaker, I decided I didn't want to see any phenolics in this wine. I could have, removed them with fining. Right? I could have done something, which is quite natural, like put some milk or something like that in, and it would have pulled out those phenolics. So you'd lose that refreshing bitterness. But what you'd end up with is quite a round, sweet tasting wine, even though it's not sweet with sugar, because all that's left is that low acidity in the flavors. So winemaking is all about that balance. And the lovely thing about making these wines is that they do it sort of almost by themselves. So I don't need to go and add anything. So I didn't really talk much about the winemaking, other than the fact that our Viogniers are made with wild yeast. But the other thing about these wines is that they're all made with no animal fining agents at all. So we don't fine the wines. Therefore, they're vegan friendly, and we're proud of that. But that wasn't the driving force behind the winemaking. It was a consequence of. And that's why I think you get that lovely sort of structure and flavor to it.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you're thinking, I'm not sure I get refreshing bitterness, it occurs to me that a good parallel may be sort of a wonderful orange marmalade, where you have a little bit of bitterness. Of course, the wine doesn't have sweetness, but your mouth is watering at the end of that bite of marmalade. Let's go to your Samuel's collection. This is named after Samuel Smith, who was the founder of Yalumba in the 1840s?
Yeah, 1849, 173 years ago.
Astounding that it's still in family hands. And I know that this wine has a little bit of oak influence, but not for oak flavor per se. Is that right?
That's right. So even though Yalumba has its own cooperage and we make a lot of our own barrels, with Viognier we don't use new barrels. The Y series has no barrels at all. This wine, the Samuel's collection, Eden Valley Viognier, is about just over half of it normally is fermented in barrels. They're French oak barrels, either puncheons or barriques. So puncheons are the big 500 litre barrels, barriques 225 litres, so just under half the size. But those barrels have all been used for fermenting some other white wine for at least 5 years. So we're just looking for the small vessels that breathe, gradually with the air as it comes in and out of the wood. And you have that lovely aging vessel for these wines. And typically for 10 or 11 months is how long the wine would stay in those barrels.
So when you have barrels being used primarily for air, as you say, for the breathing of the wine, would you say that the biggest effect of that is on texture, or is it on flavor?
It's a bit of both, but I think it's mainly on the texture. And part of it, that texture which comes in those barrels is because at the same time we've got the yeast lees, so the yeast that have done the fermentation that fall, when they finish, they fall to the bottom of the barrel, and we go in every couple of weeks and mix them all up again, and so they come back into the wine. And as they slowly start to dissolve, they do give you this lovely sort of richness and mouthfeel, as well as some flinty sort of flavors and characters. So that's part of what happens, but it happens much more in a barrel than that would if you did the same thing in a stainless steel tank. So it's that, and then the breathing, also gives this sort of roundness, and a great barrel, lets the air in slowly, so it doesn't oxidize the wine. It just comes in just at such a slow rate that it just manages for the wine to just tick along and just have these little sort of aging reactions, and it's really perfect. And we do that at quite a cold temperature because we don't want to encourage a malolactic fermentation with these wines. So much and all as I love their low acidity, it doesn't need to be any lower than it actually is. So we discourage malolactic just by keeping the barrels cold, because at this point we still haven't added anything to them. Even 11 months after they've been made, all that's in the barrel is the juice which is turned into wine by the yeast that have come out of the vineyard on those grapes.
Yeah, a very important point you've just said, and I want to underscore this for everyone watching. With a low acid variety like Viognier, where you want to preserve every bit of the integrity of that wine's acidity, you of course would not put the wine through malolactic fermentation, because that would soften and make the wine feel maybe almost too blousy, right? It would almost flatten the wine's vitality. So keeping that malolactic fermentation, preventing that malolactic fermentation makes such sense. And, as you were talking about using oak barrels, I think sometimes people don't realize that putting a wine in an older oak barrel where you don't want any oak flavor at all, but where the wine is going to open up, an absolute parallel is just pouring wine into your glass. We all know the effect that oxygen has, right? Oxygen just allows a wine to kind of expand, unwind itself, unfurl itself, as I like to say. And so that can happen before we ever get to the point of pouring it in the glass. it can happen by virtue of the way you've made this Samuel's collection, Eden Valley Viognier. And this is entirely then from the Eden Valley, right?
Yep, that's correct. So from the vineyards that literally, the Yalumba winery, which I should have mentioned, is actually just into the Eden Valley, part of the Barossa. And these vineyards are almost exclusively in a big sort of planted in a bit of a donut around the winery. We're sort of circled by Viognier. And
a moat, a Viognier moat you have.
A moat, there. What a great one. I'll use that now. Thank you. And the other thing is that the other things that have traditionally been around the winery and still are, in some cases, are stone fruit orchards. It's actually an amazing place to grow apricots and pears and peaches and stone fruit. And while we don't have as many perhaps in the region as we used to, I really love that sort of analogy, with the Viognier that's planted in the same soil as these apricots used to be. Now, I promise we don't put apricots into our wine. It's just the Viognier flavours. But I gather, Karen, and you may know more of the history than I, but I think the stone fruits were also planted above the Condrieu vineyards anyway. I think apricots, and perhaps not so much on the slopes of Condrieu, because they're very steep slopes, but in the land above. So I think there's that, where stone fruits grow, Viognier loves growing as well.
Absolutely. That is absolutely the case. Before we move to the Virgilius, which is your most maybe renowned or distinguished Viognier, just thinking about this Samuel's collection for a moment and the fact that it's from Eden Valley and right there around the winery. When I think of Eden Valley, I've been there, I've driven around in a truck with you, and after our tastings, I began to associate Eden Valley with Riesling, because your Riesling is so spectacular. And I'm thinking, of course, I've told you how many times how much I love the contours Riesling that you make. I'm wondering if, just as you said, a place that grows really wonderful stone fruits may in fact be a good place as well for Viognier. Is there any idea in your mind that a terroir that is good for Riesling may also be good for Viognier?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So if we talk about Riesling just for a moment, then I think Riesling is an incredible expressor of terroir. That's not very good English, but hopefully you know what I mean. And I think Riesling grows in very different climates. The one thing Riesling needs is some coolness. Now, for us here in the Eden Valley, even though it's cooler than the Barossa Valley, that coolness comes mainly at night, because as you go up in altitude, your night times get much colder. And so for us, for Riesling and also for Viognier, we have those cool nights when the vines have the opportunity to rest. And because it's cool, the flavors within the grapes don't metabolize out overnight. So there you keep those finer, more aromatic flavors in the grapes. Now, I think so, and I think that's great for Viognier as well. I'm not sure that Viognier would go all that well in the Mosel, for example. I think that might just be, and look, I don't know, and I'm not sure that anyone's going to plant it for me to find out. But I suspect that while Riesling you can make these amazingly different styles of Riesling from very, very different climates, I'm not so sure Viognier would be as versatile. Yet to be proven, I think, Karen, and I think that's, the exciting thing for us about Viognier. Well, I'm sure many of the people watching will say, oh, well, 40 years seems like a long time, and it does. It's still not a long time in terms of really understanding a variety and a terroir and a place. With Riesling, we have 175 years of history within the Eden Valley of growing and understanding Riesling. And we can go back and look at wines that were made 50 or 100 years ago, and we've seen the evolution. Whereas we are still absolutely learning about Viognier. So maybe I'll come back in 10 years and we can have that same question. Maybe I'll have snuck a couple of vines into the Mosel or something, and we can talk about it.
It should be pointed out too, for all of our friends and viewers who love Australian wine and who adore Australian Chardonnay, that actually Riesling has a much, much, much longer history in Australia than Chardonnay does, just as an aside.
Thank you.
All right. And now for the numero uno here, the Virgilius. Let me hold this up to the camera. this is your most distinguished Viognier. It's a bit more expensive. Tell us about this, and what does the name Virgilius mean? I love that name. It seems like it was meant to be a name for Viognier.
Yes, it's wonderful, isn't it? It's a little bit Roman inspired. And to tell the story, I need to go back to 1988 when we released our first old vine Shiraz under the Octavius label. Named Octavius because it's fermented, it's aged, this Shiraz wine, it's aged in very small barrels that we call octaves. And so we took the sort of the Octavius Caesar sort of Roman emperor idea to name this wine. And then 10 years later, in 1998, we were ready to release the first of what became the Virgilius. And we were thinking about names, and we were looking through the history of the Roman Empire, and we came across Virgil. Now, Virgil was poet and mentor to Octavius Caesar, and Virgil wrote about agriculture. He wrote very long treatises, let me tell you. But he wrote about agriculture, he wrote about perseverance, he wrote about trying and failing and trying again. And we thought, not only is it a lovely word, Virgil, which we could turn into Virgilius, but it was also what he wrote about was very similar to our journey with Viognier. And that had been, trying to understand, a new variety, understanding how it grew in the vineyards, which is actually very different to how Riesling grows, for example. The picking decisions that we had to learn how to make, and then the way that we made the wine. So it just seemed like a nice synergy. So we honour Virgil by turning his name into Virgilius.
Mm. Well, the wine is the first thing I think that strikes all of us tasting it. And if you're not tasting it with us right this moment, you must go out and find a bottle this weekend of actually any 3 of these Viogniers. And I know they're well distributed in the United States. But the first thing that strikes me is this wine has a sort of profound gravitas. It's not just a bigger wine, it's a kind of deeper expression of Viognier.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the Virgilius by comparing it to perhaps to the Samuel's Collection Eden Valley Viognier, because they're both from the Eden Valley. Neither of them are single vineyard wines. They're the blends of these vineyards, as I say, that come around our moat, our Viognier moat around the winery. And the Virgilius is a selection, the blend we do is a selection of the barrels after that 10 or 11 months that they've spent in the wine. So we bring in a small sample from each of the barrels, and we look at them all lined up. And we're looking for the Virgilius. We're looking for wines that are more complex, certainly, perhaps more of what we talk about sort of secondary, tertiary characters, the flintiness that you see from that barrel and that lees work. But we're also looking for the fruit characteristics to be a bit more reserved. And I sort of think about them being sort of a bit sort of wound up, and so a portion of wine that says, I'm not going to give you everything straight away. You're going to have to, earn that. That's what we're looking for the Virgilius. Whereas for the Samuel's Collection, we want wines that are, here I am, I'm ready to go. This is what Yalumba thinks Viognier tastes like. I've got all of my apricots and my ginger, and I'm ready to go. And that's what I always want. Anytime we open a bottle of the Eden Valley Viognier, the Samuel's Collection, I want people to open it and to have that beautiful expression of Viognier. Whereas the Virgilius, when it's opened, it should be looking, just a little bit quieter. And but then it starts to open, and then it starts to unravel. I think you used a word I loved before, I've forgotten what it was now, but a similar, this idea of a wine sort of opening up and taking you on a journey as you're enjoying this wine, hopefully over a meal, or maybe over a couple of days. So if people are looking at this wine, look at it now, look at it in an hour, look at it tomorrow if you don't drink it all today, and just see how this wine evolves and takes you on that journey.
Yeah.
So that's really what we see with the difference. So in theory, if you think about that blending process, I could be taking, one barrel out of each of our vineyards. In reality, usually most of the barrels that we choose, and we do it all blind, but it turns out that each year, most of those barrels come from that first vineyard that we planted in 1980. So there's something about that particular small vineyard that makes wines that are more Virgilius-like than Samuel's Collection like.
Wow. So 40-year-old Viognier vines. Wow. Um, I'm noticing a bit in the Virgilius, and actually kind of in an ascending way through all three of these wines, a little bit more spice, and I would call it minerality as well. Although, I mean, you're not on limestone, I don't think, and I'm wondering if you agree with those two things and where you think those ideas come from in the wine.
Well, the minerality is always one of those very interesting questions, because if you talk to soil scientists and plant physiologists, they will say to you, there's no way that the characters
Exactly.
from those stones can get into the wines. And I go, that's fine. I'm happy that they're not the same characteristics, but we all know that you get what we talk about as minerality in wines, and it does come from vines planted on particular places. No, we don't have limestone here. We do have quite a lot of quartz in our soils. They're very bony. And I think that, well, my take on minerality is that it's always a combination of, you know, some of the again, coming back to the textures and the phenolics that come from those skins and from the grapes, but also some interaction with acidity. Now, if we were talking about Riesling, I would say minerality comes from low pH in Riesling, because I think that's the characteristics that you get in your mouth. That's not the case with Viognier. So while I think part of it is it's absolutely about the terroir and part of it's about that phenolic character, I do not know why we see that minerality in here. Yeah, because it doesn't fit with the rest of my, you know, pH philosophy. And, you know, I think when we talk about terroir, Karen, so often the answer is, I don't know. You know, I mean, as a scientist, I really want to know. I want to be able to know exactly why these wines turn out the way they are. But the winemaker side of me sort of goes, actually, that mystery and that characteristics that you just don't know why actually makes them really exciting.
I love the not knowingness of wine. If we knew everything, it would just be another beverage. The not knowingness is the intrigue, is the mystery, as you say. It's what causes you to keep coming back. It's what causes us to all be on a truly lifelong journey with wine. It's yeah, it would be the worst thing. You know, you hear sometimes, Louisa, people say, oh, I want to demystify wine, and I think, I don't.
No.
That would be the worst thing in the world to me if wine.
Well, most of us wouldn't have a job then, because we'd be able to then manipulate them so they all look the same.
Yeah.
And then you're right. Then we'd lose everything that's, you know, really special about wine.
Yeah. Spiciness, though, spiciness can, I mean, on the one hand, you mentioned earlier regions that do well, like the Rhone with Syrah, may do well with Viognier. That was sort of a logical historical thought. I think we all know from Syrah that Syrah planted in cooler climates can often take on a more spicy exuberance than Syrah planted in warmer climates. But spiciness itself can also be the result of barrels or any number of other things. I'm wondering where that might come from, or is it just a characteristic of the grape where you are?
I think it's all of those things. So Viognier, I think, inherently has some spiciness to it as part of its flavor profile, and whatever those tiny flavor molecules and chemicals that are in the wine that make it taste like Viognier are, but come from the grapes. Certainly, you can add another layer of spice coming from that contact with the yeast leaves and that aging in oak. How exactly it balances, you know, I don't know. And in Viognier, we really don't know much about the flavor of it. Can I talk? Do you know? Have you spoken about rotundone as a concept before?
I've written about it in the New Wine Bible, but we haven't spoken it on Taste with Karen Live. So please.
All right. So it's not a flavor that we see necessarily in Viognier, but rotundone is what is responsible for the pepper spice characters that we see in some varieties, particularly in Syrah or Shiraz, and particularly, as you say, Karen, in cooler regions. Rotundone was only discovered here in Australia in 2007. or it was announced in 2007. The discovery had been a few years before that. Because at the Australian Wine Research Institute that you mentioned earlier, the then managing director said to his team, your challenge over the next few years, as well as doing all your other work, is to find out why some Australian Shiraz taste peppery. And so through all of the amazing, and it's a very long story, which I won't go into, but that amazing sort of science-ness that they go away and do all that stuff. And they eventually isolated this compound. They called it rotundone. They added it back to wines, and sure enough, it made other wines taste like pepper as well. And then they went and started discovering that, in fact, other things like basil and oregano have high levels of rotundone. And then they went to pepper and found that pepper was just off the scale in terms of the amount of rotundone that was there. And so what they'd done is not only discovered why Shiraz and Syrah tasted peppery, but they discovered the main flavour compound that grows in pepper that the pepper industry, of which I assume there's one, hadn't found before either. Now, I would imagine that there's a raft of different flavour compounds that we see in every other variety, including Viognier, that one day we may discover that will then be able to explain why apricots, why why spice, why all these things. But until we do, if we do, then the mystery remains, but also so does the complex interaction between them and exactly why they look like they do.
Yeah, Louisa, the chat is going crazy here with questions. So I want to, Steve Stein is asking a set of questions here. I want to get to a few of these. He actually has three, which are somewhat related and terrific. They're very practical questions. Number one, what are the components of, or what is the price of the three different bottles? And I'll answer that one. But for you, what is the aging potential of Viognier, and what food pairing do you most like it with?
Yeah, Karen, two of my favourite questions.
Okay.
So starting with the aging, these wines age, and particularly the Virgilius, age beautifully. And when I talked about the wine evolving in the glass, this wine will also evolve very slowly in the bottle. The first Virgilius that we made that we sealed under a screw cap was 2003. And that wine is still beautifully expressive. It's not big, it hasn't got fat, it hasn't got oily. It's still got that lovely sort of structure. It's still quite pale in colour. It's developed slightly darker colours, as you would expect a white wine to, but nowhere near as much as, say, a Chardonnay or even a Riesling might have with the same age. So they age beautifully. Now, having said that, I think I've met 6 people around the world, 7 if you include me, that actually age Viognier. So it's something that I think is really exciting. I think it's really relevant for those 6 people, and maybe there's a few today that might be in that boat, and I can get to my 10 fingers. But it's not super relevant for most Viognier drinkers, because most Viognier is consumed as quite young, but it does age beautifully. The food question, well, that's probably an episode in itself. You talked before when you were describing that refreshing bitterness, Karen, and you talked about the marmalade and it being mouth-watering. That's absolutely what these wines are. And I am sitting here at the middle of the morning, sipping on Viognier in the Barossa, and these wines are really screaming out to me. They're making me hungry. These wines are all wines that I think are much better with food than without. So while in a tasting environment we taste them without food, I probably wouldn't serve these as an aperitif. There are other varieties out there. We've already mentioned Riesling. That's a great example. There's a lot of wines that you can drink really happily without food, but these come into their own with food. I have a list that goes sort of, this long and goes out the door of things that go with Viognier. What I don't have is a list of things that don't match with Viognier. And I mean, it sounds a bit glib, but, I've thrown the question to every audience that I talk to Viognier about, saying, please, if you find a food and wine match that does not go with Viognier, then let me know, because I'd like to at least have a couple of things on that list.
It's going on the short list, in other words.
Yeah, well, it's a very short list at the moment. Viognier, we've captured Viognier as our brunch or breakfast wine here at Yalumba. When in the days when we used to bring in guests, or I used to travel around the world, we would use often the morning meals as an opportunity to showcase our range of Viogniers, because we do actually make red wines as well here at Yalumba, many of them. And so if I was presenting a dinner, of course, you would want to have some red wines there to be fair to the other varieties. But we figured we could just capture brunch. So everything from eggs, hams, bacon, smoked meats, mushrooms, truffles, fruits, granolas and mueslis, and all those things are wonderful Viognier matches.
Viognier for breakfast. You have got to love those Australians. I mean, oh my God.
I love things sort of, and one day I'd actually love to do it physically. I've been to various spots on it, but to take Viognier right across the old spice route of the world, through North Africa and the Middle East, and those beautiful complex flavors, the tagines, the mixing of the different spices and the layering of those characters, through into Asia and all of the different Asian cuisines, whether they're the deep earthy curries or whether they're the really bright, fresh, chili-based things, are all amazing matches with Viognier. And then if you go back, I think earlier I talked a bit about, well, no, I might not have actually said this yet, but many of the things we're talking about, low acidity, phenolics, they're things we talk about with red wines.
Louisa, let me jump in here though, because you've mentioned the word phenolics, and I think it's, I'm not sure, I'll have to scroll back up on the chat, but someone asked a really important question. I absolutely want you to answer it, which is, she writes, and I think it's Carla or Kayla perhaps, or Kathy, she writes, how do you feel and taste phenolics? In other words, this is winemaker talk, but what do phenolics taste and feel like?
So they are, they're drying. They're often in the particularly the larger phenolics tend to be on the side of your sort of tooth, this side of your mouth. They're easier to describe in a red wine because they're what give the red wine dryness. It gives them that character. If there are too many in there, it gives them that astringency and that bitterness. So
tannin is a phenolic, for example.
Tannin is absolutely a phenolic, and I use those words interchangeably, probably not absolutely accurately, but certainly interchangeably. But they're hard. They are really hard, particularly in Viognier, to pinpoint and say that's that. That's why I wanted to describe it to you, because many people will taste these wines and go, oh, I really like your Viognier wines because they've got such beautiful acidity that I don't see in other Viogniers. And it's not actually more acidity that they're tasting. It's that freshness that's coming from the phenolics. So they're difficult to pinpoint exactly, that's a phenolic and that's acidity and that's flavor. It's all just the overall balance of the wine.
Would I be right in saying that phenolic materials, phenolic compounds, are part of all plants? All plants have phenolics. Grapevines have phenolics. Tannin is the leading phenolic that we generally talk about. Those of us who are not scientists, but who are consumers, we know what tannin means, but these are naturally derived. They're nobody's adding these. They're naturally derived compounds that are present in plants.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. It's exactly right. And particularly in grapes, in the skins of the grapes, and also in the seeds and the stalks. But unless you really grind up your grapes, we don't extract the seeds and the stalks into a white wine, but the skin tannins, they often do come into it, yes. Yeah. And they come in different colors, and in a red wine, they're red. And for anybody that, and I'm sure everyone's probably better behaved than I, but if you ever spill some red wine on your white tablecloth or on your shirt and you put soap on it, it goes green. That's the phenolic or the tannin changing color with the different pH. So the basic pH of the of the soap. So I'm not suggesting you put soap into your wine.
Laundry insight from Louisa Rose. Oh my God, I'm writing this down. Yes. Let me just quickly remind, because Steve had asked earlier about prices. So I do want to say those. The Y series, the first wine that we tasted, the Yalumba Y series Viognier, is a unbelievable steal at about $15 retail. The Samuel's collection from Eden Valley, the wine that we tasted second, is $21. Still, in my opinion, an incredible steal. And then the Virgilius, the top Viognier made by Yalumba, is, and this is the Virgilius, just to remind you, is $48. And these wines are made in descending amounts as well, I assume, right? There's more of the Y series made than of the Virgilius. All three of them are incredible values for the sheer deliciousness and richness that they deliver.
And I haven't been watching every question because they have been racing in very quickly, but I did see someone that commented on, I'm paraphrasing now, but something along the lines of, I normally drink red wine, but I actually really enjoying the Viogniers. We often find people that are red wine drinkers who wouldn't typically enjoy a white wine, maybe because of their high acidity or whatever, that love Viognier. So it is a really great alternative for in any occasion, and with all the foods that you might think about that you would enjoy a red wine with. If you don't feel like a red wine, Viognier is going to give you the same satisfaction as a wine match.
Satisfaction is a really interesting word because it does have real mouth-filling gravitas without being heavy or alcoholic or oaky or any of those things. It's really satisfying on the palate. I see that word very clearly. All right. Louisa, I cannot wait for you to come back to the States or for me to come to Australia. I always learn something talking to you. I'm so grateful that you joined us tonight.
Well, I'm delighted. I'm actually hoping, all things crossed, that I might be over in October. So we will see what happens around the world in that time. But yeah, I certainly miss my visits to the market. You know, it's lovely to see people over the screen, but it's not quite the same as actually sharing some of those foods that we've just talked about. So yeah, I think you know, the world opening up again is an exciting time. We just will never take it for granted.
Napa Valley without calling me first. That's what
I promise I will not.
And for all of you who have been watching, thank you so much for joining us. Please check out also the Yalumba website. It is beautiful, very educational, lots of fantastic photos to really get a sense of the winery and their commitment to beautiful and excellent wines. And if you're interested to learn more about Australian wine in general, Australia Wine Discovered is an absolutely fantastic educational website. Just one of the, I don't know, as an educator, I can say one of the single best websites any country has produced about the wines of that entire country. So for me, again, Louisa, thank you so much for joining us. And to everyone who has been watching, thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Happy Viognier Day.